Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Ed. I feel honored and privileged to be invited to facilitate the Edmund Gordon panel on advances in technology to foster student development. I note that we recognize that Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. This session today will examine the roles of new technologies for supporting learning, teaching, and assessing. We require practice, research, and theory to assure that technologies are directed to enabling learner growth and empowering opportunities. I anticipate the anchoring quote of Girlie Delacruz's talk as we begin by signaling the importance of these issues for Ed Gordon in his own words. For educational opportunities to be equal, they shouldn't be the same, but should be customized, appropriate, and sufficient to the needs of the person we are trying to educate. That's right, customized, appropriate, and sufficient. As a developmental psychologist in the early 1980s, with a long-term interest in the social foundations of cognitive growth, I became very intrigued with the increasingly prevalent use of technologies in society, including the widely hyped developments in artificial intelligence systems at the time. Microcomputers were only rarely starting to appear in schools and in homes hardly at all. And even then, they were principally available at highly privileged sites. What consequences would these developments in advanced technologies have for rethinking human learning and development, and in the educational goals and practices of our cultures? I developed a cultural historical perspective in my work, influenced by the works of Vygotsky, Luria, and Cole for addressing these questions. I wanted to ask, what is at stake in technology designed for learning? A fundamental aspect of this perspective I developed is a view of human nature that, while acknowledging biological and environmental contributions, emphasizes that humankind is reshaped through a dialectic of reciprocal influences. Our productive activities change the world, thereby changing the ways in which the world can change us. By shaping nature and how our interactions with it are mediated, we change ourselves. Just as using physical machinery and farm labor came to mediate human interaction with nature in increasingly different ways, so too are computer technologies mediating human interactions with nature, information, and other persons in distinctly different ways. My argument was an extension of Vygotsky's arguments about tool and symbol, where he emphasized how both physical tools and symbol systems culturally mediate human activity. This perspective on the socio-historical construction of human nature was also reflected in work from Ed Gordon's Yale colleague, Bill Kessens, and the philosopher Mark Zwartowski's theories and studies of the child as a cultural invention, where it is argued that the concept of child is a social and historical kind, that children become what they are taken to be by others. Say it again, that children become what they are taken to be by others. And an expansively inclusive agenda for actualizing all human potential, following Ed Gordon's pedagogical imagination, will be achieved by developing and pervasively employing assessment in the service of learning. Assessment in the service of learning. Now that we're 40 years on in this societal transformation, with advanced computing and communication now embodied in the always-on supercomputing powers accessible through smartphones and cloud computing, what bright horizons are appearing for fostering student development and perhaps enabling the closing of the achievement gap that Professor Gordon pioneered as the focus of analytic attention and targeted for research-informed interventions. This gap, which he brought to center stage for educators and policymakers, parents, legislators, and school leaders. In today's uses of ubiquitous AI for for personalized and adaptive content, for voice and facial and affect recognition, and for conversational user experiences, what are being revealed as the promises, the challenges, and the risks. I expect we'll leave today with new insights on these matters that the inspiring work of our esteemed panelists will illuminate. Let me briefly introduce each of them. First, we will have Rich Mayer, Distinguished Professor of Psychology at UC Santa Barbara, as educational psychologist. Rich applies the science of learning to education, lately by emphasis of multimedia learning, computer-supported learning, and computer games for learning, all focusing on how to help people learn so they transfer what they've learned to new situations. Greg Chung is Associate Director of CREST. I know him best for his studies of the consequences for learning and engagement of using learning technologies like games and intelligent tutoring systems, and his astute analytic approaches for guiding the modeling of learning outcomes from fine-grained data. Dr. Girlie Delacruz is Associate Vice Chancellor of Teaching and Learning at Northeastern University in LA. She is expert in the conduct of learning science for assessment design and for integrating diverse technologies like computer games and simulations to provide innovative and effective solutions, as in math and in physics. Then we will have Jeremy Roberts, who is the Senior Director of Learning Technologies for PBS Kids Digital. Does that sound like fun? Works with Curious George, Dinosaur Train, and the Cat in the Hat knows a lot about that, to deliver innovative educational media and real-world experiences to kids from age 2 to 8. He developed the PBS Kids Learning Analytics platform, which helps parents, educators, and developers track kids' progress and proficiency in gameplay. And now, dear Rich, our attention is yours. Welcome.
Oh, thank you, Ray. Roy, hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Perfect, thank you. It's really a pleasure to be included in this event honoring the contributions of Edmund Gordon. And I want to thank the organizers, and I'm also appreciate the opportunity to be on this panel with friends and colleagues who I haven't seen in a while. My focus is on how to teach in ways that promote transfer. And I think transfer is related to Dr. Gordon's focus on intellective competence, the coordination of cognitive, affective, and situative processing that leads to deep learning and problem solving. In particular, my focus is on how to design online learning to promote transfer. I think when we use technology to promote learning for transfer and to be able to adapt to each student, the goal is to help students become creative problem solvers, to develop their ability to innovate. So I think, high quality, effective instruction for everyone is really my goal in order to develop talent of every student. So let me just give you a really quick overview. My research question, as I said, is how can we increase the effectiveness of technology-supported instruction for all learners to promote transfer? And some of the technology-supported venues that we've been focusing on in our research include online multimedia lessons, instructional videos, which we've all been involved in and subjected to throughout the pandemic, instructional animations, on-screen pedagogical agents who can be individualized to each student's needs, interactive tutoring systems, games for learning, and even immersive virtual reality. The research that I've been focusing on takes what I'm calling value added approach. And in these studies, I'm focused on experiments where we have a control group that gets the kind of basic lesson, an enhanced group that gets the same lesson with one feature added. We have learners randomly assigned to groups. We measure learning outcomes. I'm particularly focused on transfer and also learning processes, trying to understand what's going on in terms of affective, motivational, social, and cognitive processing during learning. And of course, educational relevance. I'm looking for effect sizes that are large enough to actually show a substantial effect on student learning and performance. So I'm looking for effect sizes of greater than 0.4. And even though I'm working with educational technology, my focus is on instructional methods, because it's instructional methods that cause learning and development, not instructional media. Maybe we can go to the next slide. Over the course of the past couple of decades, my colleagues and I have been conducting literally hundreds of these little experiments aimed at trying to figure out how to design online learning that will lead to deep learning and transfer for students. And I categorize kind of the fruits of this work in kind of three clusters. First of all, there are techniques to what I call reduce extraneous processing. This means cutting down on the learners focusing their limited working memory capacity on processing that really doesn't support the instructional goal. 5 techniques that we found that are helpful are coherence, which means to eliminate extraneous material from a presentation or a lesson; signaling, which means highlighting the important information; redundancy, which is the idea that we don't need to have both on-screen text and spoken text in a multimedia presentation, so we can do without the captions in many cases, although of course there are exceptions. Spatial contiguity, which is the idea that printed text and the corresponding part of a graphic should be close to each other on a screen in order to minimize the need to scan. And temporal contiguity, which means people should be able to see the graphics and hear the corresponding narration at the same time, rather than having it separated in time. By managing essential processing, I mean that even if we have minimized, even if we've created a lesson that is very clear and organized, it still might be overloading for students. It might overload their working memory. So ways to kind of manage the essential processing that students need to engage in. We've developed the segmenting principle, which is to take a complicated lesson and break it into smaller parts that can be digested one at a time. Pre-training, which involves making sure students know the names and the characteristics of the key concepts before we try to present them in a lesson. And the modality principle, which is it's best to present words in spoken form along with graphics rather than printed form along with graphics, because if you have printed words and graphics, people have to split their attention, their visual attention between the two. If we use spoken, we can offload the verbal processing onto the auditory channel in our cognitive system. And lastly, more recent research on fostering generative processing, which is an attempt to help students process the material more deeply, relate it to their prior knowledge, mentally organize it in a coherent way, select out what's important. So how do we get people to be motivated to want to learn, to want to make sense of them out of the material? Some of the approaches we've used are what I call multimedia principle, which is to present both words and graphics rather than just words alone, because when you have to see the connection between a visual representation and a verbal representation, that causes you to try to make sense of the material. Personalization, which involves using conversational language rather than formal language, using polite wording rather than direct wording, which helps build rapport between a learner and even a computer-generated instructor. Voice principle, which is the idea that students learn best from a appealing, positive voice that kind of promotes positive affect in learners. The image principle, which is the idea that just having someone's image on the screen like we have now doesn't necessarily improve learning unless the instructor can interact more with the material. The embodiment principle, which is that it's good for on-screen instructors to be able to gesture, have facial expression, and do all this with positive affect, because that promotes better learning. Immersion principle, which has to do with learning in virtual reality, and generative activity principle, which is the idea that students learn better when there are prompts to engage in learning strategies such as summarizing, explaining to others, self-testing, and things like that. So overall here, my goal is to use these kinds of principles to individualize and promote deep learning, because I think that will help lead to the kind of intellective competence that Dr. Gordon's talking about. And I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rich. Greg, welcome. It's all yours.
Great, thank you. I wanted to thank Ed, Eva, Richard for inviting me to be part of this great session. Next slide, please. And the inspiration for the topic of my talk today is really these weekly seminar meetings that Ed leads with, like, just a bunch of esteemed people in the assessment field. I'm not worthy, I'm not worthy. And so I take away two things from those meetings. One, I'm such an idiot. And then probably more important, two, is, it's sort of like over the weeks, I surmise a lot of the topics are around information from an individual, or lack of information from an individual. So I thought then for today's talk, I would plagiarize a title from a Dutch physicist in 1882, who sort of talked about how advances in measurement and observation really led to advances in scientific understanding. And in his case, Kamerlingh Onnes, he studied low temperature and how materials react to like near zero temperatures, and he discovered superconductivity. But then the only way he got there was through the instrumentation, successfully refining the measurement capability of his thermometers, basically. Next slide, please. And so I thought, well, can we use digital technology in the same spirit? That is, can we, if we have a digital environment, a game simulation, or something that kids interact with, can we extract from that interaction information about what students know, what they can do, and if so, like, what should we focus on in that digital set of interactions? So whether it's programming in Scratch, or playing a fractions game, or little kids playing Meatball Launcher with Curious George, or circuits, or algebra, these digital environments can we leverage the environment to observe students' behaviors? Next slide, please. So, some of the insights we've been gaining over the years, which go all, literally back to the last century, Netscape 3.01a, and is the idea that, wow, can we use the moment-to-moment interaction as a source of evidence? In other words, as a player in a game, I make hundreds of decisions, but then I need to act through the game mechanic or some manipulation. And if that behavior is related to the target knowledge, then that action is super informative, right? So, and then if I can score that action, give it a value, then it becomes an observation, or the observation becomes a potential measure. And so that's like one of the key insights, I think. Obvious, but we got numbers to demonstrate it. And then the other thing is, okay, well, I'm talking about mainly digital environments, but can we take this idea and move it into physical environments? So not just playing on the computer, but then say, for example, with little kids, interacting with blocks or other manipulatives that may provide information about their problem solving or other aspects of their learning. The other insight is the power of open-ended environments. And what I mean by this is, so in digital environments, you can only do what the software lets you do. Yet we know, especially with this case with little kids, man, they seem to be able to do a lot more, but man, this, whether I'm testing them one-on-one or whether it's in software, they can only express their understanding in a limited way. And so why don't we blow up the degrees of freedom of what they can do and provide a physical set of manipulatives that for little kids who can't read or write or really say what's in their head, can they demonstrate what they know and can do? And then the observation part is, can we instrument the manipulatives to collect the same kinds of sensing data that we can do in digital environments? The third insight, and everybody wants to know what the heck is going on over time. And I would say the only practical way of doing this is if you have automated observations. And really the intent is to be able to say, yes, we can observe problem solving, for example, as it occurs, not what the kid said they did, not what the teacher said that kid did, but rather what the kid actually did. So as direct an observation as possible. So yes, this may sound all great, except man, it's really hard to translate observations into measurement. Particularly process stuff. So that's kind of what we're working on now. Hey, can we make this more of an engineering process than a wholly creative process depending on a few people? So yeah, I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Greg, and appreciate your background immersing us in the 8-bit past. Girlie, it's all yours.
Thank you. So I was fortunate to be one of the ETS and MacArthur Gordon Fellows who were charged with rethinking and redesigning assessment for learning to address inequities in our educational system. And at the time, I was actually still working at UCLA Crest with a number of you all here on the panel today. And while Professor Gordon's ideas and approaches have been infused in our work at Crest, it was as a Gordon Fellow that I was able to work very closely with Professor Gordon as a mentor. And I remember talking with him about an idea where we would have students create game levels and then create collaborative playlists for other students. And he directed me to the work of Connie Yao, who was another mentee of Professor Gordon, and whose work, of course, has been deeply influenced and inspired by the professor. So that work as a Gordon Fellow inspired me to take the technology-enabled methodologies and approaches that we've been using to improve learning through games and simulations and apply it to a different context that started at LRNG and it continues with my work here at Northeastern. Next slide. So as you can see, both Roy and I were drawn to Professor Gordon's closing remarks at the end of his centennial celebration. And I chose this quote primarily because I think it embodies much of my work in recent years, which has been focused on creating customized experiential learning pathways for students, where we would be able to enable and recognize that learning takes place anywhere and at any time, right? Inside and outside of the classroom, in the workplace, in co-curricular activities at home, etc. And as I've been doing this work, I have found myself faced with two different challenges. First, how do we design an underlying infrastructure that actually enables customization through choice and adaptation? And then the other challenge is about user experience. And to me, this is at the heart of some of our inequity issues. How do we support learners to navigate a system when choices are abundant? And I would argue that technology is a critical enabler to solving these challenges. Next slide, please. An effective infrastructure for these types of pathways will need a system that can ingest information in order to understand the who, the what, and the why of our learners. Who are they? Why are they here? What are their goals? What are they hoping to take away from their learning experiences? What existing skills, competencies, and experiences are they bringing to us? In higher education, expanding our approaches to prior learning assessment to be able to enable that recognition of skills and competencies that are developing outside the formal learning environment will allow us to better meet the needs of many, especially those non-traditional learners. I've been working here at Northeastern with a number of different groups who are trying to leverage machine learning to be able to automate the extraction of the evidence that these skills are developing from existing artifacts that you find typical in the workplace to be able to scale this process. So once we understand the needs of the learners, we're going to need to be able to customize their options. And there is a universe of educational and career opportunities for our students. For example, at Northeastern, where we have a very strong focus of embedding experiential learning straight from the start along that student journey, many of our students are engaging in learning and work all throughout the world, and no two students have the same experience. This includes students combining opportunities for exploration. They're finding inspiration, they're playing around, testing things out, solving problems, conducting research with faculty and industry partners. This generation a lot of them are very civically oriented, and they are wanting to contextualize their work to be able to achieve social change while working closely with their communities. And of course, when they're going on co-op, they're engaging in learning and applying and using their skills in the workplace as early as their second year. So given that there's so much of that going on, we need to have a way to be able to curate those learning experiences and to have options to present to the learners. And that careful curation requires an intentional data architecture. As many of the panelists know here, a robust recommendation engine will actually require a strong model of knowledge and those ontological mappings of how learners can move across those different learner journeys to be able to enable choice and adaptation. And that's foundational to be able to create that backend system that will allow us to match the learner's needs with what we have available. So while the work I did and many of the expertise of the panelists here has been using data architectures to design technology-enabled games and simulations, I would argue that the same approach is needed at the macro level to be able to create these customizable experiential learning pathways. So while we don't have a shortage of learning experiences, as you can see, they do tend to exist in fragmented and siloed systems that are going to get more complex as choices and options grow. And that navigation of these choices are typically a manual and human-enabled process. I'm sure many of us have brokered this process for different learners as they're making decisions about their educational options. But how do these pathways get brokered for students who do not have the networks, experiences, or resources necessary to do this? I think in this way, we can leverage technology with careful consideration of user experience to design a front-end system that will make those options transparent. Digital badging and pathway tools like Badge or Pathway can signal to students that they are developing competence and skills. It allows them to see where they are along the journey and the different options and paths that are made available to them. We'll also need a querying and filtering approach that will support decision-making using criteria that matter. Many universities, I think, including somebody mentioned earlier, Arizona State University, they're exploring different ways to be able to serve up information for students so they can weigh out costs and time implications for those different paths so that students can better understand what the return on investment is for their different options. So while the scale and scope of the challenges I've laid out might be different from those others on the panel, we're using the affordances of technology in similar ways. And I look forward to continuing to collaborate with many of my colleagues to make Professor Gordon's assertion of equal not being the same, but rather requiring customization and adaptation to reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Girlie. Jeremy, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm Jeremy Roberts. Hello, everyone. Senior Director of Learning Technology with PBS Kids. I am truly honored to be here to lend my modest voice in furthering the work of Edmund Gordon. Thank you to everyone organizing and participating in this event. Today, I'm going to try and take you on a whirlwind, tell you about how PBS Kids and UCLA Crest have been applying advancements in educational technology to use meaningful assessment data to improve teaching and learning for kids outside of school settings. Right off the bat, I'd like to make a note that when I use the term assessment, I'm being inclusive of not only point-in-time measurements of skill, but also processes, as we've been discussing. Processes that play out over time, scientific inquiry, engineering design process, misconception detection during problem solving, things like that. I'd also like to emphasize that children's privacy and safety are our top priority at PBS Kids. We don't collect information from children that directly identifies them. Consistent with our privacy policy, we and our service providers collect information about how our services are used to help us determine what features are most popular and ensure that services are working properly and otherwise support our internal operations. We don't ever link this performance information with any other information that could identify a child's name or any other personal information. Okay, with that said, finally, I'd like to acknowledge our partners at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the generous funding as a part of the Ready to Learn grant out of the United States Department of Education that has made much of the work I'm going to describe possible. Next slide, please. Using meaningful assessment data to improve teaching and learning for kids outside of school settings. Of course, in order to do such a thing, we have to reach the kids and reach them where they are, in their home, in their communities, in the car, as many as we can. We want to be intentional about reaching kids of diverse backgrounds, abilities, and more. We need ways to get not only at sort of more conventional assessment information, but information relevant to these learning processes related to the way that the kids are approaching learning, but also processes related to how instruction is provided, processes related to how instructional materials themselves are designed and produced, and so on. And we need ways to use that information towards improving learning and teaching. And also, of course, it all has to be safe and respect kids' safety and privacy. Plus, it's key that kids and families, for us at least, love doing the things that make it possible. It's a big world out there, and they have lots of things they can choose from. Well, it turns out that kids love joyful media with rich characters and stories and worlds that spark their imagination and curiosity. And kids are using tablets and phones and computers and TVs every day to engage with media. And PBS Kids' non-commercial mission is to make a positive impact on the lives of children through curriculum-based entertainment with positive role models and content designed to nurture a child's total well-being. PBS Kids also oversees a never-ending media production pipeline for video and games, substantial website and app distribution channels, and as a large audience in the millions and millions of kids monthly coming and engaging with media in the US. PBS Kids also enjoys the PBS member stations, which is a network that exists all across the US. And these are brick and mortar institutions that connect deeply with the needs of their local communities, including partnering with Head Start, libraries, doctors' offices, and more to design and implement community engagement programs that build on the media. So the amazing media and the media channels, the very large audience, and the boots on the ground brick and mortar presences in these communities across the country, I think are a powerful formula to reach kids and families. Next slide, please. So how to get at the assessment information and how to use it towards improving teaching and learning. PBS Kids uses multiple modes of media, video, games, and they can each be wielded according to their affordances. Video can build worlds and characters and tell stories and can model problems and problem solving very well. It's good at introducing concept. Games can provide sandboxes where kids can explore while modeling causes and effects, but permitting messing about, if you will. Games can also provide practice environments with advanced feedback systems to help adjust the way that games teach and provide kids with suggestions for strategies that they might employ going forward, all based on their past attempts. And I think that these properties mean that games are beautiful surfaces that can help us understand a kid's thinking as they approach learning and related challenges. Interaction data from experiences like this can provide a robust record into what kids have seen, what they know, what they don't know, as well as how they approach exploration, challenges, puzzles, etc. So beyond correctness, beyond time to response, games can illuminate design attempts, revisions, testing, enabling analysis of these processes that we've been describing, inquiry, engineering, design, and so on. But while the technology, I think, makes getting the anonymous data pretty easy for PBS Kids, success also requires interpreting that data into meaning and making that meaning useful to the intended audiences and reaching those audiences. PBS Kids and UCLA Crest have been working on the PBS Kids Learning Analytics platform and related ecosystem of products and related research program, R&D, since about 2012. And this graphic that you see now represents a very high-level conceptual model. The goal, of course, of all this is to improve teaching and learning. The project has conducted several research and development activities towards this goal that I'd like to describe briefly. We've described the properties of educational media in fine detail with feature and content analyses, developed specifications for interaction data that span the entire interaction space for a very wide variety of educational media and technology products, generated safe and anonymous interaction data directly from PBS Kids distribution platforms, including our website, Games app, and others. We have about 60 experiences that are currently capable of generating this fine-grained interaction data. Enabled data engineering and scientific analysis pipelines that can work on very large data sets using parallelized data processing platforms, develop custom near-time data analysis capabilities to help us power applications that want to react very quickly. For example, providing reports to parents. It's places like this, I think, where the rubber really hits the road, the data to the interpretation, to the actionable insight and reaching an audience that can benefit. In this particular case, I can tell you with the parent reports, the product we created was awarded an important patent, but ultimately didn't reach a large audience of parents. And so I think, there's things, it could be a whole case study of its own, but to summarize, I think the app was too much work to set up and it was too narrow in its scope, being PBS Kids only. And it also may have been too early in time. It was several years ago. Now, post-pandemic, I think there's more uptake. I still see a huge opportunity here. But moving on, we've enabled controlled and safe data sharing with a number of research partners, such as UCLA Crest, EDC, SRI, and others. conducted engagement studies with the telemetry data, that fine-grained interaction data, to look at play patterns, to see how are these products used in the wild, help us understand how the media is actually being used, modeled skill and mastery on a number of learning goals using techniques such as item response theory and diagnostic classification models. We're currently in the process of taking the next step and doing time evolution of those models to help us look at gains over time. Developed algorithms and indicators to detect misconceptions, for example, around how preschoolers use pan balances, digital pan balances. Developed algorithms to interpret the distance between a given player's solution and the optimal solution on non-trivial design, test, revise processes. Explored adaptive game systems that react right here, right now to a player's skill level, or that optimize feedback based on what machine learning has suggested will best help that player in that moment. So another place where I think the rubber hits the road, adaptive algorithms that help the game turn left or turn right, right here, right now, based on this individual and what at least the game is able to tell their needs are in the moment. And currently, I'm very excited to say that we're developing a custom platform to enable fast randomized controlled trials using the PBS Kids Games app distribution platform. So I think about Rich's work all the time, and I feel like we're just really scratching the surface and getting started on an exciting new phase of fast randomized control trials at scale. I've been trying to screw up the courage to call Rich up at some point and ask if he wants to come play. Now's as good a time as any. We set up a service bureau actually that allows anyone inside PBS Kids to ask data analysis questions to our team. They get some consultation on matching up the question with the data and the analysis approach, and then the analysis is conducted and the insights are fed directly back into those teams based on reporting and briefing and other mechanisms, directly back into the teams that control the design of the relevant content, product, or research. This is another key place for us where the rubber hits the road. Interpretation is communicated in a manner that can be acted upon. And I'll point at this as one of our big challenges. All these different audiences that you see on this graphic, they all have different needs, different representations, different languages, different terminologies. And so it's a huge space. And I think this is a key place where investment is required for us, at least. So when taken together, I'll just sort of sum up. We're learning a lot. We're learning a lot about kids' knowledge and learning. We're learning about what kids in our age ranges and settings know and don't know, and what they can and cannot do, how to detect misconceptions in this space, how kids approach problem solving, how to analyze process-oriented data, and going from that really fine-grained clickstream data all the way on up to meaningful insights. We're also learning about our learning, and that's right. What I mean is we're learning a lot about learning, how to learn about kids who are using educational media and technology to learn. And we're learning a lot about how to feed these insights back into the behavior of the educational media and technology right here, right now, feed the insights back into the design of future educational media and technology, feed insights into things like the packaging and collection of media to the library and recommendation system that Girlie was talking about, the shepherds across libraries of media and so forth, as well as to the parents and caregivers in the kid's life. So I think I'll stop there and say that I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. What a fabulous set of topics for kicking us off and beginning to look at how these puzzle pieces relate to the big questions of the pedagogical imagination that the professor has turned us all onto. And the first thing I would like to do, especially attentive to the transition time needed between sessions, is to ensure that Ed Gordon can participate in any way that he would like here during the panel, to share reflections on contributions of the panel speakers for his concerns. Just want to be sure you're invited in, Ed. We would certainly welcome that. Until such moment as the professor's eminent hand joins us on the stage, I want to raise one theme that I expect will interweave throughout our panel's discussion. What actually happened with our technologies during K-12 education learning ecologies during the pandemic that we can learn from to foster greater resiliency in the future? I mean, we've seen so many inequities that have been exposed by the challenges associated with having to flip on a switch and suddenly do remote instruction and learning, and the ways in which families have been brought into the learning equation in a very different way, I think, suggests a whole host of ways in which they could be better supported to play these new roles that they have. Greetings, Ed. You must see that all the time in the PBS Kids data, Jeremy.
Yes, PBS Kids experienced a large increase in engagement with our informal educational media during the pandemic. They appear so far to be relatively stable, those increases in traffic. In other words, the traffic isn't fully reverting to prior levels. And we, from my perspective, we engaged in a very natural sort of reaction to try to get the word out about all the resources that we have to offer. So it was such a large scale disruption, but it was also unprecedented. And so we didn't have a lot of scripts to follow about how to get the word out. So I think that we're, at least from where we sit, looking forward to being proactive about the discoverability of resources like this in the unfortunate event that maybe future disruptions on this scale occur. I also happen to have seen on the research front many studies that had to adapt substantially to continue their work, like right in the middle because of the pandemic. My sense, based on listening to people in venues like AERA and other places, is that there were many durable innovations that came from that process. Zoom, remote data collection, allowing people from more places that otherwise might not have been able to participate in research due to driving or other financial factors, et cetera, now could be included. I saw interventions even being translated from physical apparatus to digital interventions, and thereby gaining that group the benefits of some of these digital interaction data and so on. So I think there's a lot to be studied about what the pandemic has done and its effects. Yeah.
Thank you.
Jeremy, Edward, this doesn't really relate directly to the pandemic, but my son and I are trying to think through how to make available through the internet, PBS, those kinds of facilities, what we have written about as supplementary education. And as I looked at your chart, I think we're on close to the same page. Have you thought of it in that context?
I think so. We try to be wherever families and kids are.
All right.
And there's many places beyond the sort of more traditional, school setting. I think we tend to try to look at it all as being holistic. And I think that that said, though, we do acknowledge that there is a role for media even in the classroom, and we try to provide what we term supplemental resources. It's resources that are aimed at more formal educator use cases, but that wrap around the informally available media.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one answer. A second answer might be, we are informal, and yet we have access to this audience and these rich interactive experiences. And therefore, in my opinion, the data sets that we will produce over the next decade will be formidable and will be incredibly valuable to the field who is interested in understanding human development in these age ranges, child development. We focus on 2 to 8. Most of our game work is in the 3 to 6, 3 to 7 range. And so I believe that we will be going through activities to try and make sense of this data, try and turn it into pieces of intelligence that are valuable to all of the various audiences that I had laid out, that we have laid out on that chart. I think they're going to need different affordances for all those communication methods.
Mhm.
And yet I will also acknowledge that PBS Kids is not, we do not have the mandate to focus on assessment deeply. We don't have the mandate to focus on formal education deeply. So I think what I'm trying to say is we're going to have to grapple with this stuff on some level, but not the level where it really needs to be grappled with for the larger field. And yet we also have some of the raw materials that I think those who will be deeply grappling with this could very, very much benefit.
Absolutely.
So I'm trying to pull it all together into a statement that we may be part of the puzzle in so far as we may be able to provide service to the deeper explorations going on in the field, supplement those, and help provide data sets and advanced vanguard R&D solutions that work well, or failures, or whatever insights we might have generated on some of our early vanguard exploration.
Mhm.
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Greg, the hand is up. Go for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to tag on, and Jared may not be comfortable saying this, but I'll say it for him. Given the national reach of PBS Kids playing games in every congressional district in the US. So what if we had a game that was reasonably good at measuring something like counting for 4-year-olds? And that game is, offered, it's fun, it's engaging, it's offered constantly. Then we would kind of get towards NAEP, a national sample represented, I don't know how represented, but of counting ability of presumably 4-year-olds over time. So for the next pandemic, we can directly see what happens. But anyways, but the idea of national scope games that may have good measurement properties, can they be used for a barometer of the nation's young children?
Greg, I love that. I had a related idea of the need for something like a national PBS Kids collaboratory. I mean, where researchers across a number of different institutions could work together to collaborate in both the creation of new content, but especially in understanding learner models and knowledge models and the like in a way that would advance both what's going on with PBS Kids and our scientific understanding of learning. And there are so many education data science degree programs that are suddenly taking off in this last year. I mean, dozens of them. They're all screaming for data that they need to analyze to learn the new skills that they're developing. I mean, why not couple this with professional training in the field? And same for game developers.
But not all data created equal. So I'm going to throw that in there.
Yes. That's a t-shirt.
My electronic raising of hand does not seem to work for me, so I'll do it old school, and I'll actually just I'll do it virtually here. And I want to add on to this. I think it also gives us the opportunity. Roy, you're mentioning creating professional learning opportunities. I see this as being an opportunity for early educators to learn how to be able to leverage that data in order to understand their learners from an early age, and to be able to see that developmental progress and leverage that and contextualize it in the classroom. And I think that is, out of the pandemic, one of the potential values that we're seeing is that, educators are having to embrace technologies in ways that might have been supplemental in the past and they're just directly integrated now. So I think I'm looking forward to seeing if PBS does create such a game that reaches that national reach, seeing the influence it will have on our early educators as well.
Yes, wouldn't it be a treat if psychometricians could all begin to work more on assessment in the service of learning?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
If I can chime in also, Jeremy, I really love to hear more from you. So it's fun to see what you're up to. Looking just more broadly at your question, Roy, I think some of the things that at least I've learned through the pandemic and the role of technology in education is that there's a need for kind of a human technology collaboration, especially when we're working with kids. I don't think technology by itself is all that effective, and it just really highlighted the need for the role for adults and to be involved in it also. I also would say, just me personally, it highlighted, I think, the need for better quality instruction, better use of the technology that was there. And I think the research community does have a lot to offer, and it's kind of highlighted to me, we need to do a better job of communicating what we do know, and we need to do a better job of addressing some of the issues in future research. And I think it just reminded us of the idea that technology doesn't cause learning, and that we have to adapt technology to the learners, and also it has to fit into the niche that the teachers have for it. So all those things kind of came to my mind in response to your question. I mean, just makes you think of a lot of things. It's a very provocative question.
Yes, I mean, one thing that strikes a lot of us looking at both the promise and the challenges of high bandwidth interactive learning is that many of the mechanisms by which from infancy we learn how to learn from one another are lacking in a very deficient way. Joint visual attention is what gets kids learning language from the first few months of life. Children virtually from birth will follow where their parents are looking so that they can begin to talk about the locus of their joint attention. They learn to point, they learn to follow pointing, and all of that building common ground, as the psychologist Herb Clark talks about it, is something that we know how to do in order to situate our learning in the particulars of the contextual situation, whether it's in the family or out in the community or in the classroom. And the technologies are abysmal at supporting the common grounding associated with learning. You've got all these kids looking at you. You can barely see their eyes. You can't see how they're regarding either the learning materials or you or one another, because of course they don't have that bandwidth available to them. So the technologies have unfortunately been premised on a stand and deliver MOOC delivery paradigm.
Right.
So I think you're right that it was unfortunately inherited a lot of problematic pedagogy. In fact, Rich, it's the antithesis of virtually all your principles.
Yeah, that's true.
But on the more positive front, I think each of you have something to share about how your work is achieving adaptivity to human variation in support of equity. I think that's Ed's enormous signature. And so I'm sure you each have something to share on progress along those lines.
All right, I'll go. So I don't know. This must have been like 5 years ago. I was reading this paper, the Proceedings of the National Academy, on pigeons. Pigeons have learning curves, and the like literally different aha moments. And I was like, damn it, man! If pigeons, I mean, and we're like pigeons, right? In that sense. And then the other part of the paper was like, you know, the problems of averaging. So when you average across individuals, you know, learning looks like this. Whereas at the individual level, there's variation across, you know, it's kind of like a step function. There's this slow learning, presumably learning, and then, aha, bam, I get it. And then, you know, so that really sort of like got me thinking about, well, maybe we should focus on the individuals as the unit of observation. And then, you know, and then what does it take in a tech environment to measure aspects of the individual? Like what? So what is it about the interaction that is important to reflect and to represents the individual's learning, and then and then just really focus on that part. So pigeons, that's my North Star.
Well, you called out a North Star that I thought was really worth a lot more thinking, which is what if we could begin to get ground truth on the situated learning activities that children are involved in using multimodal learning analytics and capture of everything from biometrics to arousal to interest to engagement, and could work on not only cognitive aspects of learning, but social emotional learning. Obviously, fully cognizant of the trade-offs there between privacy and personalization. This is starting to get exciting, where people are beginning to. Yeah. I saw that hand that time. Thank you, Girlie.
We all our hands.
So who won? Did I win? Okay. So I wanted to address your question, Roy, and build on on what you were saying, Greg, in terms of pigeons, but not really the pigeons, but more of that. How do we define the interaction? And I think that's where the competency-based movement, as it relates to being able to describe what mastery and proficiency looks like in terms of those behavioral descriptions, is setting up the educational system to be able to do the stuff that you're talking about, Greg, things that we've been focused on, being able to describe learning at the fine-grained detail in order to build a game or in order to measure at that level. We're now seeing across the board at different, at a different scale. So I think that, and that's where my work moved from the individual within a game and really thinking about an individual within a context or a situation and what that competency looks like from beginning to end during that situation. So I think that, to me, ties to Professor Gordon, your push for having us be able to make transparent and describe what competency looks like, right? So that and translating that for other learners so that they can also be able to benefit from good pedagogy and good assessment practices moving forward.
Rich?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts rolling through my head right now, but just in answer to your last question, Roy, I really think there's a lot of potential in using the kind of online information we have as kids are interacting with technology to shape the direction of instruction. I mean, it takes the idea of formative assessment to a whole new level if we can kind of have instantaneous information and we can adjust to that. And I agree, focusing not just on the cognitive side of it, but also the motivational, affective and social side of learning, because I think, especially when we're talking about learning with technology, part of the challenge is to build a kind of rapport with someone who is not even physically with you, and it maybe isn't even human. The child is trying to build rapport with maybe a computer system and still feel there's a social connection. So in order to build that and to build positive affect and to build motivation, it's great to be able to have data we can use. I think the problem is there's so much log data out there. We have to figure out what metrics to focus on. That, to me, that's the big challenge and the downfall. I mean, a lot of the times we talk about how great information we're getting in, but we need to be able to interpret it and use it. So it's not really the amount of the information. I think it's the quality of it that's going to be helpful. But I'm also thinking, in answering to your question, there's just such a strong need. I mean, I'm involved in an elementary school district here in Goleta, and I'm keenly aware of the idea that if kids don't learn to read well by the 3rd or 4th grade, they have a very high probability of not finishing high school. So, and we also, so building literacy and is just so important in the elementary grades. And I do think technology has a role there, especially for kids who learn in different ways and at different rates. Technology can pace and adapt to them. So I think there's a lot there. And I'm also aware that even coming into kindergarten into a school district, there's big differences in what kids bring. And it just reminds us of the role of early childhood education. So I'm happy to see in our state we're moving towards universal pre-K. I think that's a great first step, but it just tells me maybe technology doesn't have a huge role to play in preschool, but there are probably ways to incorporate it that makes sense.
Yes, Jeremy.
I have so many thoughts. I'm struggling. First was, I agree completely with the sentiment that the interpretation is the key challenge. The meaning making, I think there's a noise problem. I think we have a lot of noise. Perhaps we need some new conceptual razors that will help us cut away. So that was one thought. Second is, well, I'm very focused on media for young kids at PBS Kids, of course. I think about games a lot as a part of that work. In my view, games and simulations, et cetera, that can be cast as games have a lot of potential for adapting to individual needs, but they are, of course, limited to the information to which they have access. I have seen games that I felt did a good job adapting in the moment by providing a next challenge that was tuned in difficulty level to the player's current skill level. I've seen systems that I thought were promising around tuning the level of information provided in feedback and the mode that the feedback is provided in terms of media modality, as well as the way that the feedback was phrased. I have seen at a slightly larger level interesting attempts at systems whereby in a library, the pathing, I think of what Girlie was talking about, pathing through a large number of possible options. It's trajectories through these potential spaces, a very large number of possible trajectories, which are the trajectories that do the best at some definition of success, which is another thing I really wanted to point at briefly, which is at PBS Kids, we don't have individual level demographics. We don't have age, gender, SES. These are anonymous kids. We're working with anonymous streams of data from these kids for the most part, accepting our recruited studies, which are more rare for us to do than population data studies. And so, I want to point out that what we are able to use as an input for some sort of adaptive or personalized algorithm or what have you, it's very limited. But even so, I see us making strides towards understanding what this particular individual is capable of and needs. And it brings up some really interesting thinking around groups of individuals versus individuals. And even if you don't, for example, see a group level effect, if you did the job for a few of the individuals, is that not something of value? And when you look at the wide variety of individuals across the entire population, it starts really getting at this question: what should our definition of success be? I think it's even relevant to the admissions discussion that was happening earlier. Should we be admitting the people who are already doing the best, and giving the resources to them, the educational experiences, or I mean, why not optimize for producing the most gains? If we can enter into this world of empirical measurement of learning gains in an automated fashion, why not optimize for producing the most gains when integrated across the entire population? Or why not optimize for carrying the largest number of individuals across some absolute threshold that we've determined is important? Okay, I'm sort of wandering at this point, but I felt like I had to say.
Certainly lots of fertile ideas there. Where I thought you might be heading and where I think there's a lot of promise is in small group learning, like Elizabeth Cohen wrote about with group-worthy tasks, but in a digital realm. It would be a really good way, and we already know this from pair programming. It's one of those signature pedagogies of computer science. And what you do there is two people work together to program, they switch roles, and they are accountable to the work of the team. So you've got each person being accountable to not only their own learning, but the learning of somebody that's in a small collective with them. We could scale this up to bigger numbers than just pairs, small groups, as in Liz Cohen's work. And it would be a very different kind of unit of analysis. It would also be something more akin to what we'd like to see in society, which is people learning together, not only learning alone. Rich?
Oh, I'm not muted. I think that's a really intriguing idea. Group learning online, or computer-supported collaborative learning, I think, has so much potential. The challenge, I think, is you kind of have two things going on. One is there's kind of the possibility of more what I would call extraneous processing or distraction, because there's a cost when you have to communicate with other people and just the whole mechanics of that. But we have to weigh that against the benefits of what you get out of interacting with people, having to explain to other people, having to understand their explanations, which can lead to a lot deeper learning. So I think, what as researchers, what we need to do is figure out, how to design or structure those interactions in a way that it's going to be most productive. I mean, sometimes people talk about having scripts, so that having a more scripted situation or more constrained situation so that it won't go off the rails, but then that limits kind of the creativity of what goes on. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to go on about how to design those interactions.
Yes, it's literally a subfield of the field of computer-supported collaborative learning, those that work on scripting and the risks of over-scripting. Hey, Jeremy.
Wanted to follow on with it seems like the peer programming is a good example of two learners that are sort of mostly of the same station collaborating together. We've also been experimenting at PBS Kids with intergenerational learning. Those experiments are just beginning now. Mm-hmm. And I'll tie that to some work that longstanding work we've done where the digital media is actually intended in part as a jumping off point into real world activities where the concepts embodied in the media that get the kids hooked, and now you can go do those activities in the backyard or at the local park, and all sorts of complementary experiences, not just the screen type stuff. So I wanted to sort of try and tie that together and say that peers, I think there's a huge opportunity there, not just peers, but also the family, you know, the wider structure here, and getting that out into the world. I do believe that Rich is right in saying that there's a cost that can be exacted in the communication overhead and all the other things that go along with the social aspects. But I also happen to believe there's some big wins maybe that we can get if the kind of learning experience that is fostered in the digital world can then have a life that transitions into the rest of the day or other places and non-digital experiences. Thank you.
Girlie, I think you had your hand up here a little bit. I thought you had some common themes going around a number of you around competency, assessment, badging, learning pathways. I mean, people didn't use the term knowledge graph, but I suspect Greg, without too much provocation, talk about that. I mean, it seems like there's more and more energy towards finding a way to begin to take note of the full learning ecology of the child, not only in school, but out of school. And the notion of being able to earn badges for things that you're doing out in the physical world, not only the things that you're doing in a technology mediated way. And do you see at the undergraduate level more of an effort towards that, Girlie, or either at your institution or nationally?
Definitely. And what's interesting is the digital badging, the affordances of digital badging, we're seeing that being leveraged largely when in the non-credit space, right? So outside of the formal courses, but I've been eyeing the acquisition of Concentric Sky and Badger from Canvas. And now Canvas owns Badger Pathway, and Portfolium. So all of a sudden you've got this, you know, ecosystem of technologies where we can start to extract data from skills both in and outside of the formal courses. So that's some of the things that we've been exploring here at Northeastern, how to be able to leverage that so that we can use badging to be able to connect and recognize that learning that's occurring outside of formal courses, that things are happening at co-op, for instance, and then signaling to students, if you've developed those skills in co-op, these might be courses that you may want to take, right? So I think the technologies are catching up to some of the goals that badging and the competency-based movement, you know, called for recently. So, yeah.
And to return to that theme of Ed's that I like so much around supplementary education, so that you look at the full learning ecology, community, family, home, even faith-based organizations. When people have really started to study in detail what the actual opportunities are in terms of learning resources, I'm thinking now of Nicole Pinkert's work at North Chicago is the city of learning, and she and Penwell essentially did a detailed mapping of the after-school learning resources in the city of Chicago. And it turns out that you will not be surprised to learn that they tremendously vary by zip code and level of the families and the communities. And there are huge parts of Chicago that are learning deserts in terms of education resources. And there's also very little effort to map the resources that there are in those communities. So that's a public policy issue, which does get me to a question that you knew was going to be coming. With priority transformations, we need to have greater success in research strategy, policies, practices, and even attitudes.
I want to signal to one something, Jeremy, that you've mentioned several times, the issue of privacy as it relates to data. And I think you mentioned it just in your more recent remark about not having access to demographic data and that you're just watching individuals, but we know context matters, right? So Roy, to your point, when you talk about individual data, knowing where they are, knowing the resources that are around them will help support us in that meaning, that interpretation. And I think, and I know the IES has been funding a lot of work in this area in building networks around in that rapid, the rapid experimentation, where the issue of data sharing and data privacy becomes critical, because if we can't solve that, or we need to be able to address that in order to be able to push these ideas forward. So I'm curious how other panelists have been dealing with issues of data privacy in the context of the richness of what we have available.
Well, it would behoove us to allude to a disaster 10 years ago. There was enormous enthusiasm around the In Bloom project, which was funded by Carnegie Corporation, but especially the Gates Foundation, something like $150 million to build a learning infrastructure that would enable non-for-profits and for-profits to be collecting data, making recommendations for student learning activities on these learning pathways. And New York City, a parent had the right to begin to dig more deeply into, well, how is it that my kid is suddenly sharing their data with companies that are working with this, not only not-for-profits? And a little due diligence made it clear pretty quickly that they had not bothered to engage in industrial strength, best of breed knowledge around data privacy for the K-12 learners. And so that was an extremely ugly blow up that had huge amount of investment. And I would say at South by Southwest in that year, just before that happened, I went to probably 100 presentations that were around the future of personalized learning that we're all going to be running on this infrastructure. So what could be done to get past such a disaster this time?
Roy, if you don't have anybody commenting, I will, because it reminds me of a discussion. It must go back to 30, 40 years now, when we first knew that computers were possible and were coming on the way. There was a philosopher up at Syracuse University who was kind of speculating about it. And he thought that society was going to have to do away with privacy. He thought that he didn't know whether the policy decision would be made before we just realized that it didn't exist anymore. Now, if we look at the power of technology, of what can happen in cyberspace, the fact is that we don't really have much privacy left anymore. It's a kind of wishful domain of wishful thinking, given the power that the freer exchange of private information can provide for society. Maybe we've got to put it on the public policy agenda. Let's get rid of it. I long ago have given up trying to keep my business private, because if I use the computer, it's kind of there if I put it there. And if I want to share it, how else am I going to get to know what you think about it?
You raise such a vital topic. And if you haven't read Shoshana Zuboff's Surveillance Capitalism, it is a must read for just
absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And public policy, I think, is going to hit this first around AI and issues of deep learning and functions. Can't even begin to imagine. And if advertisers are going to be driving everything that goes on, I think there's going to be legislation that's going to have to get in the way of it. Hey there, Jeremy. You must think about these issues all the time.
I do. From a admittedly limited perspective. We try not to collect anything that could directly identify any child. We do worry that cognitive signatures eventually will get to the point where problem-solving characteristics or other characteristics could form a brain print that could be used to identify someone if there were other data sets out there somewhere else that had also that level of granularity around their cognitive processes and also had their personal information. Imagine somehow Amazon knows how you solve problems, and then now you could imagine linking attacks. So we think about avoiding, trying to prevent or reduce the potential for linking, reduce the potential for re-identification later. This is not my field. I hope I don't mention this, but I have been reading lately about some debates between people who say, oh, it's this huge risk, you know, the re-identification risk is real and it's going to happen. And there are other people who are saying, yeah, but you just ignored 40 years of research into anonymization techniques. And if you were just review this work, you'd see that there are very well established anonymization techniques that provide mechanisms for data sets to be anonymized and shared safely among parties. And the counter is, yeah, but not everybody's going to be following those processes and so forth. And so I think what we are probably trying to do, I don't want to speak for everyone, but you know, we're going to be more concerned with the safety and privacy of the children and learners than maybe some of the commercial sectors. I hate to paint with such a broad brush, but it's just how I think about things. So where I start to get fuzzy is okay, now when these two paradigms intersect, what does it actually mean for the end result? Is it still tractable to ensure privacy in a mixed environment like that, or is it not? I don't have an answer, but these are questions that I'm having these days.
We have come head on to this problem in public health. And I think are rapidly going to have to forget about privacy in the interest of protecting all of us.
I think you boot us to a Socratic dialogue that we unfortunately cannot continue, but should. And the open-endedness of it has teased us all in wanting more, and thank goodness there's another full day ahead. So I want to thank each of you for your phenomenal insights and contributions, and the beginning of this new university around the pedagogical imagination that you have set up such an infinite frontier for, Ed, in your writing.
Thank you very much, friends. Thank you very much.
It's all yours, Kara.
Thank you, Roy. So on behalf of CREST, I'd like to thank our unbelievable collection of panelists today. I feel like I'm in the company of giants. Particular gratitude goes to Dean Christie and Dean Millen. We had such an excellent introduction to our conference from Linda Darling Hamilton. And of course, we're all blessed to have Dr. Gordon with us in all our sessions today. We're so appreciative of your thoughts, your research, your goals, your ideas. You're challenging all of us on what we think we know about learners and assessment. And I thank everyone for that today. So we have an early start tomorrow morning for day 2 of the event. On the West Coast, Best Coast, we start at 8 a.m. With session 3, which is cultural context and affirmative pedagogies. Session 4 is learning and instruction innovations in classroom settings. Session 5 is assessments integrating teaching and learning. And then we have a closing session where we have such names as Kenji Hakuda, Pedro Noguera, and we'll also have comments from Professor Gordon.
So thank you again, everyone, for joining us for day one, and we're looking forward to seeing what day two brings for all of us. Thank you.